whenever I get a script or a scene, I look at perspective. That's really important because it gives a point of view for the audience to identify with. And it had to become Galadriel's point of view because she's sort of the thread throughout every season. I mean, she's so badass and she's our warrior. So we had to be her.
Episode 6 ends with Galadriel's perspective, and episode 7 starts with Galadriel's perspective.
You almost could have cut them together and showed them in one long film.
The idea was we wanted to feel like the world was collapsing in on her at the end.
Everybody was really into it. It was messy, grueling work. At the end of the day, you go home and take a shower, and it's like, oh my God, you spit out cinders.
Her breath closes out the episode. You hear the wind approach, envelop you completely, and then you hear her breath echo out over the black before the credits roll.
Hi, my name is Alex Disenhof.
My name is Charlotte Brandstr.
My name is Robbie Stambler.
I'm Ron Ames.
And I'm the director of Rings of Power. First season, I did episode 6 and 7.
I'm the cinematographer for episodes 6 and 7.
I produced all of the technical departments from camera capture to exhibition.
Supervising sound editor on The Lord of the Rings of Power.
And this is Varieties Making a Scene.
My day one on this project was just crazy because I obviously arrived in New Zealand. You spend 2 weeks in quarantine. And when I got out of quarantine, I was told that I was starting to shoot 2 weeks later. And I said, what about prep? And they said, well, you're going to be prep a bit throughout.
Normally you get into a project, you have like 12 weeks of prep and, this was just, let's go, we're doing it.
The end of 6 is the explosion of Mount Doom and the world changing for the Southlanders and also for the orcs, creating Mordor. And 7 is the aftermath. So I was very lucky to get 6 and 7 because they were two episodes that were very connected together. It felt like doing actually a long feature, not like doing 2 episodes because you had the beginning, the middle, and the end. So that was actually quite amazing to do.
When I took the job for the Rings of Power, I was not told anything about what was going to happen in my episodes. I was being given the apex of season 1 in terms of the content, but I had to fly all the way to New Zealand. It was then I found out what would happen. And we really had to jump right into it and start testing different things, and especially for the aftermath.
We knew that we were coming to Mount Doom throughout all of it. Jason Smith and I would listen and the creators would tell us their idea. And then we go in the other room and go, oh my God, how are we going to do this? So because we knew that, 9,000 visual effects, this is like making 4 feature films. It was huge. And this was one of the key moments that we knew we were going to be building to. The first challenge in creating an event that is included in nature, this is something we know what this looks like, or we have ideas what this look like. So how are we going to actually physically make this believable and not look like a cartoon? So we went immediately to research and we started looking at descriptions of Pompeii, Mount St. Helens. So we were very respectful of Tolkien's descriptions, his drawings, the sharp peaked nature of the mountain itself. We were also inspired by Peter Jackson's work and what had come before. And we knew that people have a vision of what this is. We wanted to be unique, but not tragically unique. We wanted to actually take what everybody had done and then make a very clear interpretation in our world.
We needed to understand that there was this key that we had been teasing throughout season 1, this broken sword. And by putting it in this stone and turning it, it would essentially unlock the dams that would then allow the water to flow underground into these tunnels that the orcs, throughout the season, we've seen the orcs digging these tunnels. We haven't known what they were for, allowing the water to flow through under the village, hitting the magma, the lava in the mountain, and causing the explosion, which was loosely based on real science and how it would cause something like that.
There was no part of this that we allowed to be not connected to true physics. what was going to happen there and what mechanism inside the mountain, basically a machine that had been built thousands of years before. And so we designed roughly what that machine was going to do and be. And it was a water's works, basically a dam that had been built in and disguised into the side of the mountain, looked like a small waterfall. That literally was also based on a place that we found. So that actually is photography of a real body of water. And this was another part that both Jason and I are extremely proud of, is that that work is done between 4 different vendors. So Weta Digital, ILM, Rising Sun, Method, and even for a couple of shots, DNEG. All the vendors work together to create a unified vision of that event. So we would actually have reviews with all of those teams working together. So everybody was like all shoulders to the wheel to make this thing happen.
Within the dam, there's all sorts of ancient engineering, and you never really see it. There's one shot where a stone is sort of retracting when he puts the sword in, and you can see him reacting, and you can see him acting in the moment, listening to the mountains around him sort of reacting. So telling that sonic story off screen without, lines to color in, it's just pure fun. It's not like dwarf level engineering. The dwarf stuff is very refined. They're meant to be the most fantastical engineers in all of Middle Earth. We wanted it to be sort of the most technologically advanced version of what you would hear in Middle Earth. And then going the exact opposite with this ancient technology that's existing in the mountain. It was made, but it was never really ran. And so it's a bit screechy. It's a bit dry. It hasn't been oiled. If it wasn't for such deep, thoughtful production design, the sound can't really reach those levels.
When the water comes through town and bursts up through the holes in the ground, it was important for us to establish geography. And so we played a lot of it in big wide shots. It was also inspired by the fact that we did it for real. And so you could see these huge spouts of water coming up. It would have been a shame to just focus on little close-ups of the ground as it was exploding, because these things shot up in the air for real, 100 feet in the air.
You get better reactions from the actors and the characters and the extras. So it's easy for them to react. Otherwise, you just have to imagine what's happening around you. And they never get the sense of it. And actually, we were even surprised ourselves. They all sat at the table. And the first time we did the water explosion, I don't think anybody expected it to be so big, to come up so much.
We played a lot of it wide. You could see the destruction of the village. It then allowed the visual effects team to take that and augment it to an even greater level of destruction. It's a spectacular thing to have in camera, and to have the extras running around getting soaked and our actors getting soaked, and there's something you can't replicate if it was pure visual effects.
When the lava is shooting out of the volcano and it's landing amongst our heroes, almost like bombs going off, we needed to create sort of an explosion impact sound. But it couldn't just be your average everyday TNT or even earth gravel sort of displacement explosion. It needed to have a different element to it. So what I did was I took the sound of recordings of a wet sponge being dropped into a deep fryer, which is an incredible, dangerous thing to do. I would never recommend anybody do that.
And it was also important that Mount Doom happened at the moment when they were all happy. They had won the battle. They felt they were out of it. They felt that they were safe. Everything was good. And that's why I feel like it was such a surprise and so strong at the end of that episode, because Sundays, it was completely unexpected when the water started spurting. And that meant that it started there because the pressure under the mountain became really strong, and then Mount Doom started to explode. And then their world was basically falling apart completely.
It was important for us to create this environment that felt sunny, felt warm, colorful, bright, to then make the horror of what is happening even more shocking.
Is in film always about contrast? You want to destroy a beautiful world. You want to damage something that's beautiful. So you wanted everything to be lush and beautiful. They were all cheering and drinking and laughing and enjoying themselves when suddenly everything around them started falling apart.
At the very end of the episode, Galadriel is really overwhelmed by everything that's happened. She's in a state of disbelief. And, while everyone else is running away, she's almost frozen and just watching the world crumble right in front of her. And we wanted to capture that by center framing her and pushing in from a wider shot to a closer shot. I think it's broken up in the edit. The idea was we wanted to feel like the world was collapsing in on her at the end. And at the very end of the episode, making it back to her point of view. She's the focal point of much of the story.
Whenever I get a script or a scene, I look at perspective. That's really important because it gives a point of view for the audience to identify with. It had to become Galadriel's point of view because she's sort of the thread throughout every season. And she's so badass and she's our warrior. So we had to be her.
I really wanted to give the impression that she was now in front of this huge wall of ash was approaching her, blocking out the sun. That made it feel different from the sunny, bright day that we had just had. So it was really about scheduling the shot later in the day when she was in shade. And then in the color correction, we could push that even further. And obviously with the visual effects coming in, we couldn't have smoke around her.
A huge element in the build up to the very end of the episode is all of this air coming at you, this enormous, dust cloud of debris, and there's thunderstorms happening within it. There's a little micro weather system occurring within the debris cloud. Really tapping into that high frequency, shrieking, shrill wind sound and feeling it get closer to you and closer to you. And then ultimately Galadriel's standing there. And if you listen to the mix in that moment, we get rid of and fade out of all of the sort of crowd, ambient terror reacting to what's going on around.
Over the wall! Theo! Theo!
And even the sort of debris, that stuff kind of goes away. And you're just left with this all-enveloping, screaming, shrieking wind that's traveling at you. And then you hear her breathing and sort of preparing for what's about to hit her. Morfydd, when she recorded the breathing, I'm sure that she didn't know we were going to be featuring it in such a way. I mean, it all came together in the mix.
Over the wall! Theo! Theo!
It's an incredible emotional through line, and it's so potent amongst the really epic music that Bear McCreary wrote for that sequence.
We then did keyframes of art. We looked at the color because we knew that we had to photograph this, that there was going to be pages and pages of dialogue, and we were going to be shooting on stage and out on location. How could we duplicate this? How could we make this light work across all of that?
It was determined that because we wanted the environment to be so smoky, so full of ash, we really needed to be inside because it's just impossible to control smoke like that in an exterior location. On a scale of 1 to 10, the amount of smoke in the air, this was 11. And the only way we felt like we could do that and also create the light that we wanted to create was to do it inside in a controllable space. So we had this huge old horse barn arena that was transformed into a stage. And I created a massive softbox all the way around the set using sky panels, very, very, very soft ceiling. We then also surrounded the set with muslin, white muslin, instead of green screen or blue screen. So there was no green screen, no blue screen at all. And then it was weeks and weeks, probably 3 or 4 rounds of testing with the camera and with the ash in the lights to get the shade of red that I wanted. I didn't want this neon red. I actually took a lot of inspiration from the wildfires that were happening in California. I had been caught in one up in Oregon a few years ago that turned the whole sky, the color that you really see in the show is pretty much the same. 85 to 90% of what you see there is in camera. It's an amazing feat from so many different departments.
Ash blankets and paper mache ash on the trees and foam, and we'd block out the light, and that's how we did it. It was like painstaking, but all of us working together.
And then when it came to shooting Galadriel opening her eye, the ash itself is paper. It's actually very similar to what we use for fake snow. I think maybe they dyed it a little bit grayer than normal white or something like that.
When she's covered in ash, the most difficult there was for the actress is actually to open her eyes and have not getting ash into her eyes.
Morfydd, who plays Galadriel, had to lie on the ground. She had to close her eye. Then they had to cover her. She couldn't move, We had the camera right in there. And to create I wanted a round reflection in her eye, so it didn't feel like a film light. So I cut a piece of white card to be a circle and, bounce some light into it to get that reflection. It was a great way to start the episode. And second shot is starting the camera upside down at Galadriel's hands and then pulling the camera back up over her body as she's lying down, and then turning it as she wakes up. I wanted to give it a sense of disorientation. Her world has been turned upside down, literally. I believe we even shot everything at maybe 36 frames per second or 48 frames per second to give it this ethereal feeling. We wanted to almost feel like we weren't even sure if this was reality anymore, because it's so much of a jarring change from what we just saw.
I remember asking Robbie then in LA to really make everything very subdued, as if it's a world covered in cotton.
Silence is the loudest thing you can do in a film, which is crazy.
When you've had a big explosion, you don't hear anything for a while. Your ears are actually ringing.
I always love to ask filmmakers when I work with them, like, what's your favorite sounding movie? And I had a conversation with Charlotte really early on when she had mentioned The Hurt Locker. And the big takeaway from that for me was point of view and perspective. So starting with Galadriel waking up in that sort of dazed, muffled state.
You don't hear the people screaming in her. You don't hear anything.
But over the course of the scene, as she comes to more and her ears start to come back to life, it's almost like the sound of reality is down the hallway and you're slowly going down that hall, and then the door slowly opens and all of a sudden you're in that world where you're actually hearing everything properly. Bo Borders and I created a really fun tool, which would utilize the Atmos ceiling speakers, where we took the sound of a multi-tap delay effect and we would pan it into the ceiling, and then it would kind of like animate in the pan. So if you had like a sort of, it would be like kind of echo out over you in this sort of dreamlike state. So And what's cool is up into episode 7, we had used that technique a handful of times, and it kind of became a sonic motif for, dreamy, weird, surreal, abstract moments.
50% of it was there, and real fire was there as well. So then we added both more fire and in front of the camera, you see little cinders going by, little flaming cinders, right? Like literally in front with like a little fan blowing these little hot embers across the way. And then we add more into the background for where the actors and everything else are.
We would create all these layers of flame so that in the mix, bow could pan it specifically to where you're hearing it on the screen. And then, of course, there's dynamic fire of like a torch moving across the screen, which we would then animate that pan. Not every show I've worked on where every lighting source is supposed to make a sound. It was a challenge for sure.
It's a fantasy series, but it's very grounded. I feel like the characters are grounded, and we want to believe in the world. The magic and what happens to our characters comes from natural elements like the wind and the smoke and the fire and the water. Because it's not science fiction, we don't want any lighting effects or any things added on that way.
It becomes very easy to say, well, it's magic, so it does. No, we never did that. Not once, not ever. It was all based on reality. Now, we believe that the depiction of magic or supernatural events are descriptions of science that we don't fully understand. It's bent physics. So we wanted to make sure that the audience is swept with the reality of it and that it is powerful as can be.
It's a very technical show, even with the scale. So I learned a lot about visual effects, special effects, or the whole collaboration, putting small pieces together. When you do a normal show, I mean, you do a scene in the street, on the office, you don't need to prepare it. For those scenes, you need to be really prepared because it wasn't much time to shoot it, strangely enough. And we only had time to do certain amount of shots. So they all needed to be right.
Whenever we view it with an audience or even a small crowd, I wasn't looking at the screen, I was looking at people's faces. It really is such a great pleasure to watch with others, or even afterwards when it aired, sitting in my living room with my neighbors and friends. It's a great joy to see them react.
The quality of work, the detail, the efforts of the sound department would have been impossible without top-down support. There are several people that were champions of the sound department and really understood the value that we can bring. Work like this it's impossible to do by yourself.
For me, I was in high school when the Lord of the Rings films came out. They were a huge influence on why I wanted to make movies. I remember that moment sitting in the theater thinking, this is what I want to do.